I want to say sort of two final words about Ruth. I know we kind of started talking about this last time. And remember, we talked a little bit about Ruth as a moral resource. So two final words about that, and then we'll go on to 1 Samuel. So remember, we've talked a lot in thinking about Ruth about this really important concept of Hesed, H-E-S-C-D, which means something like covenant, loving, faithfulness. It's a description of the kind of love that God practices to his people Israel. It's also the kind of love that we see kind of exemplified both in Ruth and in Boaz in different ways. Now, I think this is a really important thing because it's just a reminder here that both in the Old Testament and also the New Testament, there's really not the rigid distinction that later Christianity makes, mainly Protestantism, between this thing that we call faith and the other thing we call works, as if those two things could somehow be separated, right? So the paradox of the modern church, right, is that we have a lot of people who talk about their faith, but it doesn't seem to affect their lives. And on the other hand, right, we talk about people who like do good things, and that's the justification for not having any faith. So that's actually a problem that we actually don't need to have, in the sense that the idea here with Hesed, right, is you can't simply neatly separate faith and then what you do. And to kind of make that point, and to help us kind of see that it actually carries over very much into the New Testament, that is, the New Testament is sort of thinking along these same lines. There's a wonderful passage in Ephesians that I think that makes this point. Actually, the whole letter does, but there's one passage that makes this in a point in a wonderful way. You actually probably hear it almost every Sunday. It's Ephesians 5, 1 and 2, and here it is. Therefore, Paul's talking to the Ephesians, therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. Now, I could spend like half an hour talking about that one verse, but we don't have half an hour, so just one thing about it. Notice the really important word here is walk. So Paul's reflecting the fact that by the time that we get to Judaism in the first century, there's the rabbis have kind of divided up the Old Testament into sort of like two categories of literature, right? On one hand, there is story, narrative, the book of Exodus, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and Kings. These are like narratives, right, that tell you about things that are happening. And the second category is literally, it's called Haggadah. It literally means how to walk. The really important point right here is, right, Paul clearly believes that being a Christian is not just simply a matter of like thinking things, but rather it's a matter of walking. And notice this, right? He isn't saying, now, I want you all to be really nice, friendly, compassionate people. Notice what he says. Be imitators of who? God. That's a really important point there, right? That is, in effect, right, God shapes and forms a people who are capable of imitating him, imitating his own pattern. So that's one thing. Second thing is this, and I think this is also important too. I think that there's another really important thing about Ruth that's significant that we, once again, in the church, we often fall down on this. And that's this. One of the things that's really essential for the moral life, and I'm going to underline the word essential. I don't mean optional or, gee, it would be great to have this kind of thing, but essential, is examples. That is, one of the ideas here, right, is one of the important things about this story is, right, is that we are not just reading a sort of a nice story where, by the time that we get to the end of it, we find a kind of some version of, and they all lived happily ever after, da-da-da-da-da-da. No. What we're given here, certainly in Ruth and then in Boaz too, is we're given examples of what it means to live out Hesed. And that means, right, that it's going to have to be lived out in different contexts under different situations by different people for different reasons. And in that sense, right, we need examples. We need to see how this stuff gets lived out in people's lives. And of course, historically, right, this was one of the reasons, right, for the whole this whole category of people that we call saints. Right? In effect, right, they're kind of like standing all before us as examples, right? In effect, right, this is what life under grace looks like. Here, and here, and here, and here, and here. And of course, it's not all monochrome, right? Because even the people who have been canonized are radically different in all kinds of ways, right? There are sort of like, the mystics, and then there's sort of the great intellectual saints, like Augustine or St. Thomas Aquinas, right? They cover the whole gamut, but the important point still stands, right? And that is, examples are crucial. That's why, and I say, I think one of the great crises in the church today is, we are lacking examples. We need them, okay? You can preach all you want, you can teach all you want, you can talk all you want about how important it is to have a moral outlook, and it'll be like of no help. We need examples. So that's 2 points. Yeah, go ahead, Jan. Yeah. It's a long question, and I think that the brief answer, right, is that Luther is thinking about a very particular kind of situation where, in his judgment, right, works have come to predominate over faith, but it doesn't actually argue for the correctness of his position, which is obviously incorrect. Okay, so let's go on to Samuel. We are now going to declare Ruth finished, and our understanding of Ruth complete, total, and absolute. And now we're going to go on to Samuel. So let me say just a few words about Samuel, and then we're going to dive into chapter 1. So I just want to kind of remember where we are in the story, right? Where we are in like the grand scheme of things. So remember, right, at this point, Israel is not a nation like we think of it today, right? Israel is primarily a confederacy of tribes, bound together only by a covenant relationship with God. Some of the tribes are fighting amongst one another. They've always been fighting amongst one another, so that's part of the story. The book of Samuel, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and the books of 1st and 2nd Kings chronicle the transition from tribal confederacy to nation under a united monarchy occupying a specific territory. That's what these 4 books chronicle. And we just want to note one thing. I mean, this will become clear as we go along, but I just want to note like one big overarching point. It's really important to notice that this transition is not wonderful, glorious, and to be celebrated. Because as Israel becomes a nation in the modern sense of the word, right, central government occupying territory, that doesn't mean that her covenant faithfulness actually increases. But rather, by the time that we get to the middle and then finally to the end of the story, we actually find Israel's flirtations with paganism becoming more deep and more serious. And of course, the story ends, as the end of 2 Kings makes clear, right, with the disappearance of the nation altogether, with the Babylonian exile. So it's just really important that although the storyline here is transition from tribal confederacy to nation, it's really important to notice, right, this story is not being told as sort of a wonderful, glorious, golden thing where, we're moving from primitive situation to like a modern, updated situation where everything is lovely. The transition is very, very ambiguous, and we'll see this particularly when we get into 1 Samuel 8 with the origins of the monarchy. We'll see that the people of Israel come to Samuel, whom I'll say more about in just a minute, and they say, look, Samuel, this isn't very flattering, but they say, look, Samuel, you've got one foot in the grave and the other on a banana peel. Your sons are no good, and so we want a king. We want a king, and here's the important phrase, like all the other nations, right? And, one of the things that you obviously know about the Old Testament, right, is anytime you see that phrase, like all the other nations, right, that is always bad. Okay? It is never good. So we'll see that when it comes, but that's a kind of big picture thing for now. One quick note about Samuel, who obviously is in some ways the star of 1 Samuel in a way. A lot of attention will be devoted to him. So Samuel here is an important figure because he's both Israel's last judge, so he will be followed not by another judge, but by a king, Saul. Samuel is also a prophet. That is, he speaks to the people of Israel on behalf of God. And we'll also see that he also has something of a priestly role because he'll be offering, at one point, we'll take a look at this, he'll be offering sacrifices. So Samuel is a very interesting figure because he's kind of this judge, prophet, and priest all rolled into sort of one figure. So he's a very interesting figure indeed. One final note here that we want to kind of keep in our minds because it's, once again, an important context note. One of the things that we always have to remember when we're reading both the Old and the New Testaments is that we're living and thinking about a world that's very different from ours in all kinds of ways. But one of the ways that it's really, really different is, in our world, right, we make a really fine and in some cases absolute distinction between what we call religion and what we call politics, right? In our world, right, those two things have been very much separated out. And then sometimes they get confused and put together in different ways. We just want to note, right, that the world that we're talking about here has not made that distinction. Okay? That is, Israel's law is a law which governs both the religious life and the civil life, although that distinction is a modern distinction. It's not a distinction the Old Testament makes. It's not a distinction the New Testament makes either. Okay, we just want to get the picture right here that when we're talking about rule or authority, we don't have an understanding that there's a thing over here that's called like secular politics, and then over here in another category, we have a thing called religion. And the two can be like completely separated in their own little boxes. Here's a good example. This is what Paul says in Colossians 1:13. Remember, he's talking to people in the Roman colony of Colossae. So if you were born in Colossae, right, you are a Roman citizen. That's a big thing in your mind. And here's what Paul says to them, or at least part of what he says. Talking about Christ, he says, he, Christ, has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us into the kingdom of his beloved Son. Notice those are two political terms, right? Domain, kingdom. Domain of darkness, kingdom of his Son. Paul clearly does not think, right, that the kingdom of his Son, Jesus Christ, is simply a sort of a spiritual reality that exists up in the sky somewhere. No. Paul clearly thinks, right, that the kingdom of the Son of God is something that actually affects the whole of reality. Okay? You can't sort of divide up the world and, well, this is the Jesus kingdom, that's another kingdom out there. Doesn't work that way. So we just want to kind of recognize, right, that we're living and talking about a different world. So let's take a look at 1 Samuel 1, verses, I guess let's take a look at the first 8 verses. That's kind of the setup to the story. So we're gonna get an introduction here about the birth of Samuel. So here it is. There was a certain man of Ramathaim Zophim of the hill country of Ephraim, whose name was Elkanah, the son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had two wives. The name of one was Hannah, and the name of the other, Peninnah. And Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. And they're right away, right? We get the introduction to the central problem right off, right? We have a guy by the name of Elkanah who has two wives. One is Peninnah, and we find out that Peninnah actually has quite a number of children. And then we find that Hannah has none because she's infertile. So, crisis, right? Once again, we just want to remember, Hannah's childlessness is not going to be perceived in this culture simply as like a personal problem. That is, the grief of childlessness is not just, something that Hannah's experiencing because, she wants to have children but can't. This is a tribal society where if you are infertile, right, there's a sense in which you are going to be perceived as a threat. You are non-productive. And so there's going to be like a fairly sort of heavy element of shame that is going to attach to you. And so right away, right, we see that this is a problem that's going to have to be dealt with. And of course, it is dealt with in a really interesting way. So here's how this story continues. Now this man used to go up year by year from his city to worship and to sacrifice to the Lord of hosts at Shiloh, where two of the sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were priests of the Lord. On the day when Elkanah sacrificed, he would give portions to Peninnah his wife and to all her sons and daughters. There's Peninnah's children, sons and daughters. But to Hannah, he gave a double portion because he loved her, though the Lord had closed her womb. And a rival used to provoke her grievously to irritate her because the Lord had closed her womb. So there's another problem, right? Peninnah, wife number one, is in effect taunting Hannah, wife number two, about her childlessness. And it wouldn't take much imagination to get a sense of what this would involve, right? This is another one of the problems, right, with polygamy. Wife number one says, hey, Hannah, who's the wife in this family that's done their duty by producing descendants? Not you. Who's the one that's contributing this family by having children to kind of be an inheritance for us? Not you. So we just want to get a sense, right, of kind of where Hannah is and why this is such a significant problem and concern. So it went on year by year. As often as she went up to the house of the Lord, she used to provoke her. Therefore Hannah wept and would not eat. And Elkanah, her husband, said to her, Hannah, why do you weep? And why do you not eat? And why is your heart sad? Am I not more to you than 10 sons? We've heard that phrase before, right? Back in Ruth. After they'd eaten and drunk at Shiloh, Hannah rose. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorposts of the temple door. Then, once again, a really important little note here. We have the tabernacle set up at Shiloh. Outside the entrance of the tabernacle, right, there's like a chair. Think the cathedral back there. And that's where Eli's sitting because he's not only a priest, he's also a judge. So he's hearing legal cases there at the entrance to the tabernacle. So Eli's there. She was deeply distressed and prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. So Hannah's come to the tabernacle to sacrifice, and while she's there, she is weeping bitterly and praying to God for deliverance from her childlessness. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your servant and remember me and not forget your servant, but will give your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life. And no razor shall touch his head, meaning, of course, that Samuel is going to be a Nazirite, just like John the Baptist, right? So someone... Yeah. Apparently they can be forever. Yeah. And John the Baptist was too, right, as far as we know. So that's Hannah's prayer. So when I recognize something that's really important, right? We want to recognize that, and this background will be filled in later, right? But we're told that as all this is going on, Israel is also like worshiping Canaanite gods and goddesses and all this stuff. And now here we have Hannah, who's come to the tabernacle and is like earnestly pleading to God to deliver her from this situation, clearly believing that he can. And of course, right, this is what faith is all about, right? Hannah is pictured here as sort of an example of what faith looks like. As she continued praying before the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart, only her lips moved, and her voice was not heard. Therefore, Eli took her to be a drunken woman. And Eli said to her, "How long will you go on being drunk? Put away your wine from among you." But Hannah answered, "No, my lord, I am a woman troubled in spirit. I have drunk neither wine nor strong drink, but I have been pouring out my soul before the Lord. Do not regard your servant as a worthless woman. For all along I have been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation." So the idea here is that normally, right, prayers would be said out loud. Okay? Hannah apparently is a sort of an exception to this rule because she's praying silently, as the text says, in her heart, but her lips are moving. Okay? Eli, who, as we discover, is not a reliable judge of these matters, dismisses her as sort of like, here's some old drunken lady. She's kind of like wandering in, and, heaven knows what she's doing. That is, right away, the story helps us to begin to get a fix on Eli. And that is, his judgment in most of matters relating to God is not trustworthy. And that this will be like a strange thing, right? On one hand, we have this guy who's like, a judge, priest, authority. Hannah, who's something of a nobody. And yet, right, their sort of standings are actually very different because Eli really doesn't know what he's talking about, whereas Hannah does. And that's an important point in terms of how the story unfolds. Then this is what Hannah says. This is what Eli says. That Eli answered, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant you the petition that you have made to him." And she said, "Let your servant find favor in your eyes." Then the woman went her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. They rose early in the morning and worshiped before the Lord. And when they went back to their house at Ramah, and Elkanah knew Hannah, his wife, and the Lord remembered her. And in due time Hannah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Samuel, for she said, I have asked for him from the Lord. So two things about what happens here. First, this little phrase, it sounds kind of small, but it's actually quite important. We're told here that the Lord remembered Hannah. Now that could be maybe a little open to misinterpretation, right? This doesn't mean that God somehow suffers from senior moments occasionally and says one day, "Oh yeah, I forgot all about Hannah. I was supposed to do something for her and forgot all about it." So it's not that. This same phrase is used in Genesis 8:1, where this is right in the middle of the story of the flood, remember? And flood comes, remember, everything's wiped out on earth except what's in the ark. And then 8:1 begins, but God remembered Noah and all the beasts and the livestock that were with him in the ark. It is really important theological note here. What saves Noah and everything in the ark, and what delivers Hannah from her situation is that God takes note and acts. Really important theological note, right? That is, the idea right here is, and this says something really important about God's character, right? A, God actually knows what's going on in the lives of his people and in the life of his creation. And he takes note of that and acts, right? We've actually gotten, we actually will get a note of this later on in the book of Exodus, right? Right in chapter 1, when we're told about Israel's suffering in Egypt, right? And we're told, right, and the Lord heard the cries of his people. So notice what's happening, right? How does Israel get delivered from Egypt? God. Okay. How does Noah and everything on the ark get delivered from the flood? God. How does Hannah move from childlessness to bearing Samuel? God. Really important thing here, right? I think we take this for granted, right? But it's a really important theological thing, right? The idea here is that one of the things that makes the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, different from all the other things called gods out there is not only is his knowledge of things complete, but he acts mercifully toward those things, right? You can call upon the Lord and expect some sort of response, not because you've been a good boy or girl that day and you got your gold star and you now earned something. But rather, whenever we pray for anything right, what we are counting on is we are counting on the mercy of God that's been promised to us. That's what covenant's all about. So that's what's going on here with Hannah, right? Hannah is, in effect, a sort of an icon of the covenant. She calls upon God, trusting in his mercy because she believes that it's been promised. Really important point. We'll have to stop here, but I just want to make one final comment, and then we'll take a look at the birth of Samuel that is described in the last part of chapter 1, and then we'll take a look at the Song of Hannah in chapter 2. As you may know, right, very often people in the Bible are given symbolic names, right? Names that say something about them. Abram's name gets changed to Abraham, great father. Sarai's name gets changed to Sarah, sort of like queen or something like that. Samuel means something like he hears. So notice what's going on here. Hannah names her son Samuel as a testimony to the fact that he's only there because God heard her. That's why Samuel's here. Samuel is, in effect, a living, breathing sign that God hears. We've also seen another person in our journey through the Old Testament who also has a symbolic name, and that, of course, is Joshua, whose name means something like the Lord saves. So Samuel here is going to be sort of like a living, breathing, walking, talking reminder of the fact that, yes, the Lord does, in fact, hear. So we'll start tracing the story of Samuel next Sunday. And if you want to read ahead, please do read the Song of Hannah that's in chapter 2. We'll make some comparisons between it and the Magnificat in Luke 1, and then we'll move on from there. Yeah. Yeah.